Steve Osunsami watching this with me, our national correspondent. You celebrated Juneteenth as a little boy and knew that many members of your community, your own friends, some of them didn't even know what the holiday meant.
I did, David. We were, when I was a child, members of an AME Black Methodist church. It was a family reunion. You had to bring a dish. It had to be good. It was on a hot day like this one in June. It was a celebration that usually didn't happen in mixed company, but that is changing today. And now there's the question over symbolism versus substance. The debate that will take place in Washington and in state houses across the country about passing laws to enforce and underline the very freedoms that this holiday celebrates. David?
Steve, thank you. The president holding up that bill. He has now signed into law, marking Juneteenth a federal holiday. And as you heard Steve say there, and we love that he shared this story with us, that as a boy, he celebrated Juneteenth with his family. But it was a celebration that you wouldn't hold in mixed company. And as Steve so smartly pointed out, hopefully beginning today, that is no longer the case in this country. That Americans will learn the history behind the final black slaves in Texas who waited years after the Emancipation Proclamation before learning that they had freedom too. The president speaking to Opal Lee, who he said he met in Nevada not long ago during the presidential campaign. He jokingly said she told him that she loved him. And he said, I'd like to believe that she does. We'll ask her that at some point if we get the chance or the honor to meet her, but we are sure, certain that she loves what has happened today after many years again, fighting for this to become federal law. Steve alluded to this, Mary Bruce, our senior White House correspondent, that there is still a lot of work to be done. You cannot overstate the history of this moment, but also there remains work. The president talked about that. He talked about the assault on the sacred right to vote in this country. The White House knows there is a lot of work ahead.
David, you heard the president say this is a moment to celebrate, but also an opportunity to grapple with where we are as a country. While Washington is finally coming together to make this a federal holiday, a moment that is long overdue, it is also, we are seeing these growing calls in Washington to back up this commemoration with really substantive action on bigger priorities. There's this federal push to guarantee voting access, as we've seen more than a dozen Republican states pass these stricter voting laws. This comes as we have seen a push by several states to limit how race and inequality is taught in American schools. And of course, as we still have not seen any big, grand, sweeping police reforms out of Congress, despite the year of racial reckoning that we have seen. So this is a moment to take stock, as the vice president said, to look around at the action and inaction that we have seen here in Washington.
The president, Mary, thank you. The president inviting several members of Congress up to that table, as I mentioned. Vice President Kamala Harris pointing out that the Senate voted unanimously to make this a federal holiday. Bipartisan support, overwhelmingly bipartisan, even in the House, though about a dozen Republicans or so voted against the idea. Still, this is a rare moment in Washington and a historic one, given a support for this on both sides and overwhelming support for that matter. Leah Wright-Rigueur is a professor of American history with Brandeis. She's also an ABC News consultant. And Leah, great to have you with us. You and I were talking earlier, and I found it interesting that you considered today somewhat of a surprise, somewhat unexpected. But given what you've witnessed in this country over the last year, George Floyd, the reckoning over race, the long overdue conversation in this country, that perhaps this moment was fueled by all of that.
Well, I think one of the things that's so deeply surprising about this moment is just how unanimous it was. We just heard that the Senate voted for this unanimously. Almost all of the representatives in the House of Representatives, except for a handful, voted for this. They pushed it through enthusiastically. And that's after years and years and years of people pushing for Juneteenth to become a federal bill. So it all happened very rapidly. But at the same time, this is, I think, something to be expected. And it's something that is directly connected to the protests that we've seen over the last year or so around the death of George Floyd and the murder of George Floyd, which is that in the immediate aftermath of that first round of protests and rebellions, one of the things that we saw was that the call for Juneteenth to become a federal holiday emerged much louder than it had in the past, but also that organizations, corporations, private institutions very readily turned to the idea of Juneteenth as a way to essentially atone in a rather simple fashion for everything that had gone on. So certainly it doesn't meet the demands of activists, of civil rights leaders, of people that are pushing for dramatic institutional and structural change in this country. But it began to get at, right, the symbolic element of inequality that has persisted in this country for so long.
And as you point out, it's the beginning of an important conversation, one that's long overdue, and perhaps the true hard work begins now. Not to say that this wasn't hard work indeed, particularly when you see images of Opal Lee, who has fought for this for so long, legislators and supporters of this moment whispering into the president's ear. And we took note that the vice president said as she stood there in the East Room opening with her remarks that we are gathered here in a house built by enslaved people, just footsteps away from where President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And she explained how those final black slaves in the South in Texas waited years before learning they were free. A programming note here, Juneteenth, Together We Triumph, a Soul of a Nation special event. It airs tomorrow night, Friday night, right here on ABC, a celebration and resilience in observance of Juneteenth. It also features Michael Strahan's interview with former President Barack Obama. That's tomorrow night beginning at 9 p.m. Eastern. And before I let you go, we just thought we would end this special report with that image of Opal Lee, the president kneeling right before her. She is 94 years old, again, an educator from Fort Worth, Texas. And when that state and just a couple of other states recognized Juneteenth, she then made it her project, her wish that this would become a federal holiday. And today, that has happened. Our coverage continues on ABC News Live and at abcnews.com. The entire team back for World News tonight. I'll see you then. In the meantime, good day.
Hi, everyone. I'm Diane Macedo. We're continuing coverage now after President Biden just signed into law Juneteenth as an official federal holiday, marking the day where all slaves in this country were finally told they were free. That day happened 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, but in Galveston, Texas, those slaves were still continuing to work there under the guise of ownership. Again, that day was the day they were finally told they were free and their slave owners forced to give up those slaves. And so joining me now with a little bit more on all of this, LA Times columnist and ABC News contributor Elsie Granderson. Elsie, we heard the president saying that today and signing this into law is about two things. One is about recognizing the past and realizing the stain of what he calls America's original sin and the impact that not only had then, but that it had now. But on a more optimistic note, it also acknowledges the promise of what's to come.
Yeah, I mean, it was a beautiful ceremony. And, you know, I'm not going to pretend as if it wasn't emotional. It was absolutely emotional to listen to the remarks, to see so many people who had worked so hard to make this moment happen. It's important. It's a very important moment in this country's history because it also admits that the July 4th Independence Day wasn't an Independence Day for everyone. That while certainly the country was free from Britain's rule, everyone within the country were not free. And the simple fact that you had these some 250,000 enslaved people in Texas still living under that bondage years after the Emancipation Proclamation, President Lincoln was assassinated, and those people in Texas still didn't know about the Emancipation Proclamation. That's what we're talking about here. So this day is so important because not only does it celebrate everyone within the country being liberated, if you will, but it also acknowledges a sin in which people were purposely kept in the dark about their rights, about their freedoms. And if you look at what's happening today with some of the rhetoric coming out of Congress for some of the members of Congress, you can hear elements of that same attempt to keep people in the dark about the facts and about the truth.
All right, and I want to go to our national correspondent, Steve Osunsami. Steve, I know you've been covering this story throughout the year, really, in all different communities around the country. How are communities of color reacting to this? And I know you have your own interesting experience celebrating Juneteenth growing up, but also realizing a lot of people had no idea the holiday even existed.
Yeah, I'll start with the first part of that. How are people reacting? You know, I've heard a couple people today in black circles call this is our Independence Day, our July 4th. That this is sort of enshrining it into the fabric of America, this particular day. That's really the largest sort of voice I'm hearing on black social media about this day. But I'm also hearing that there is a conflict now between the symbolism of making this a holiday and the real work that needs to be done that you alluded to in Washington, at state houses across the country, by some who want to enshrine the freedoms that this holiday celebrates, in particular, voting rights. The voting rights bill that's being discussed in D.C., and also the efforts in state houses across this country to adjust voting rules after the last election in a way that many people feel is harmful to the black vote. So there are a number of conflicting feelings on this. I'll say from a personal experience, I remember as a kid celebrating Juneteenth at an AME Methodist, a black church that my family belonged to for a period of time. It was a celebration. It was they called it Freedom Day, a family reunion. You had to bring a dish. It was a hot day, always, it seemed, like this one. But it was an event that did not happen in mixed company. And what has happened today with the signature of the president is this is now a holiday for all Americans. And that is a significant change. But it must not be lost that this is happening in large part because of the growing conversation that we're having in this country about race, conversations over racial reconciliation, conversations on racial justice, social equity. Those conversations led to this event where you have a supermajority of lawmakers in D.C. who agreed to make this day a holiday. Diane?
And I want to go to White House correspondent Mary Bruce on that, because, Mary, as Steve points out, this is now a holiday for all Americans. But this is also a law passed by almost all of Congress, unique these days in Washington to see our lawmakers agree on anything. But this was a bill signed into law with bipartisan support in the House and unanimous support in the Senate.
Yeah, the bipartisan isn't a word we say or hear often in Washington these days, and yet you did see Congress coming together, both parties, to finally make this a federal holiday, to commemorate this important moment in our nation's history. And as Steve-O said, a moment that now will be celebrated by all Americans. But we are also seeing in Washington growing calls to back this up with really substantive action on some weighty priorities. You know, you heard the president say that this is a day to celebrate, but also a moment to grapple with where we are as a nation. The vice president saying this is an opportunity to take stock. It clearly shows how far we have come. Just the fact that we saw Kamala Harris, the first, not just the first woman, but the first woman of color to be vice president, speaking in the White House, a house built by enslaved laborers. There's no stronger symbolism of just how far this country has come than seeing that. But it also is a chance to really look around and look at how far and how much this country still has to go. You know, it comes, as we have seen, this push at the federal level to guarantee voting access, as more than a dozen Republican-led states have passed stricter voting laws, laws that advocates say will only make it harder for people of color to vote. We are also seeing a push by many states, many Republican-led states, again, to try and limit how race and inequality, how our nation's very history is taught in American schools. And of course, we still haven't seen any big police reform bill out of Congress, despite this really incredible year of racial reckoning that we have had. So yes, this is a moment to celebrate, a moment that many say is very, very long overdue, finally making this a federal holiday. But it is also a chance to look around and see how much further this country has to go.
And Steve, I know you're going to be digging deep on this tomorrow as part of the Soul of a Nation series that you've been working on all year. You guys are exploring Juneteenth tomorrow. What can we expect to see?
Well, one of the big things we expect to see is an interview with GMA anchor Michael Strahan and President Barack Obama. That is definitely one to see. His thoughts on the conversations we've been having in this country on race over the past year. That is tomorrow night between 9 and 11 p.m. We also have a piece from Kenneth Moten, who looks at the struggles of black farmers in America. Lindsay Davis has a piece where she discusses some of the allyship issues between black populations and other populations, white neighbors, Asian American communities. And then I have a piece in this broadcast as well, focusing on black excellence. We focus on a family that is really the very definition of Juneteenth, a pair of sisters who are responsible for more than $100 billion of property development and building across this country. And so it's an exciting program. We are working on it as we are talking right now. There's a large team that's putting it together. I've seen bits and pieces of it. It's one of the most beautiful programs I've ever seen. And you'll see the heart and soul of a lot of our team that is working on this program. And I can't wait for America to see this tomorrow night.
Looking forward to it, Steve. Again, that special is called Juneteenth. Together We Triumph. It airs tomorrow night at 9 p.m. Eastern Time here on ABC, and it will also be airing the next day on Hulu. We can all check that out. And finally, I want to go to Brandeis University American History professor Leah Wright-Rigueur, Dr. Leah Wright-Rigueur, for a little bit on the history of what this moment means today. We just saw the president sign this federal holiday into law. It has been 40 years since we've seen that happen, Dr. Rigueur, and the last time we saw it was for Martin Luther King Jr. Day. So from a historical context, what does that mean?
I mean, from a historical perspective, this is a historic moment. The United States very rarely signs into law federal holidays, and we can actually already see that there's been a bit of pushback, although very real substantive pushback. And I think that's exemplified in the fact that Congress voted almost unanimously for this. So the Senate voted unanimously, and the House of Representatives largely voted for it, except for a handful of people. So there was widespread consensus that this should be a federal holiday, and that given that there's been, essentially nothing over the past of almost the last 40 years, I think this is a significant and historic moment, and we should account for that, even as we acknowledge that it is largely a symbolic moment.
All right, Dr. Leah Wright-Rigueur, Elsie Granderson, Steve Osunsami, and Mary Bruce, we appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you.
And again, President Biden has just signed it into law. Juneteenth is now an official federal holiday. Will start being celebrated tomorrow.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.